Content warning. Welcome back to my mini-series, The Enforcement of Hierarchies. If you have not done so already, you may want to watch the previous 3 videos before continuing. They contain some of the terminology that will be used in this video.
Bodies on the ground, blood, shattered glass, people dead. It was sad. It was scary. Our safe space is no longer our safe space, and we are a broken community, and we shouldn't have to come together after something like this.
The United States, and indeed much of the world, is in the midst of a series of interconnected reactionary movements. A reactionary movement is a campaign to return society to a previous status quo prior to emancipatory egalitarian victories. When society makes progress and grants new rights to people who previously had fewer rights, this emancipation is viewed with continued skepticism and even disdain among people who preferred the previous hierarchy. Those who disdain this new status quo are almost exclusively people who benefited from the more rigid hierarchy. A reactionary movement forms to turn back the clock, stripping away these hard-earned rights. This is accomplished in the media, in the streets, and finally, in the courts. A reactionary movement must convince enough people that these egalitarian victories were a mistake. A common method to do this is first by tarnishing the public image of those who benefited from the victories. Presently, there is a reactionary movement against the LGBTQ community. Previously settled matters of public discourse, sensitivity, tolerance, and acceptability have been reopened by the right wing, putting the rights of LGBTQ people up for debate again, as if the existence of a people and the humanity of a people are both topics to be debated. This has been accomplished by restarting an antiquated, anti-LGBTQ talking point, the alleged danger of non-heterosexual people to children.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick. A sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex.
Yeah, they're doing it again. This reactionary movement was popularized in the digital space by right-wing figures like white supremacist conspiracy theorist Jack Posobiec and Christian fascist Matt Walsh. Posobiec is quite literally the king of fake news, as described by the media and fact-checkers. He helped propagate the erroneous Pizzagate conspiracy theory. He attempted to discredit anti-Trump protesters by planting fake signs at rallies. He made up stories about Disney and Star Wars to agitate conservatives. He falsely claimed that U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch called for blood in the streets, and that Bernie Sanders ordered his supporters to take down Donald Trump. He invented fabricated stories about pipe bombs during the George Floyd protests and riots, and so much more. He is a professional liar. Matt Walsh is a far-right media personality who consistently invents stories and make-believe figures to demonize the LGBTQ community. He advocates for teenage pregnancy and teenage marriage because he believes that that is when they are the most fertile and most vulnerable. He does not actually care about the well-being of children. He cares about stoking anti-LGBTQ hatred. In the mainstream space, this reactionary movement is furthered by elected officials like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He famously advocated for the Don't Say Gay law. He also does not care about children, openly endangering them during the pandemic. The reactionary movement is dishonest on its face and ushered in by dishonest people. That alone should have been a red flag, but here we are. By forming a reactionary movement around this talking point, those who wish to turn back the clock can claim that their efforts are not in service of stripping away hard-earned rights or demonizing innocent people, but only that the movement wishes to protect children. The reactionary movement claims that the LGBTQ community is sexualizing children in 2 ways. First, simply by existing openly and not in secret. If a teacher is married to someone of the same gender, and this comes up in class, or is just known, the reactionary movement claims that this is sexualizing children. If a teacher is a man who is married to a woman, or a woman married to a man, the reactionary movement claims that this is not sexualizing children. To the reactionary movement, this is not hypocritical, because to them, being gay is inherently more sexual, more dangerous, more perverted, and more confusing than being straight. This is not true, and I'll get to that later. Second, the movement finds examples with the worst optics possible and creates a panic about LGBTQ people in general. When LGBTQ people defend themselves and give greater context to the example, they appear to be defending what the reactionary movement is claiming is happening when it is actually just more complicated and nuanced than that and requires a greater explanation. If they say nothing, it's worse, because they concede the point and cede ground in the discourse. In this case, the reactionary movement is claiming that the LGBTQ community is sexualizing children and grooming them for sexual abuse because they are sometimes allowed within the same room as a drag queen. If a man is wearing clothes more traditional for women and children can see this, the reactionary movement claims that this is sexualizing anyone who can see it. If a man is wearing clothes more traditional for a man, the reactionary movement claims that this is not sexualizing children. To the reactionary movement, this is not hypocritical, because to them, life outside of their traditional gender norms is inherently more sexual, more dangerous, more perverted, and more confusing than life inside their traditional gender norms. The reactionary movement is careful not to make any claims of specific abuse, because there isn't any, at least not at drag queen story time. Instead, they claim that the mere presence of LGBTQ people in public, to them, is the abuse. They are tying the language of abuse to something that is not abuse, so that when people point out that it is not abuse, they can use that as evidence of people defending abuse. It's a con, it's a trick. It's not real, but some people have been fooled into this rhetorical sleight of hand. The concept that these are men's clothes and that these are women's clothes is a social construct. A social construct is a concept that exists not in objective reality, but as a result of human interaction. This categorization is not something that grew naturally. It was determined not through biology, but through culture, a culture that is constantly changing. It is no more dangerous or unnatural for a child to be around someone wearing so-called men's clothes or women's clothes, regardless of the gender of the individual wearing the clothes. It is also not inherently sexual for someone to do this, and therefore it is not sexualizing the child. The end goal is not the removal of RuPaul's Drag Race. The end goal is the removal of LGBTQ people from anything public because, they reason, there are always children in public somewhere, and there are always children watching television and movies. If the reactionary movement can convince you that teenagers being taught by an openly gay woman is abuse, they can convince you of the next step. That openly gay characters in movies that are not rated NC-17 is also abuse, and if they can convince you of that, they can convince you of the next step, and the next, and the next. A student being taught by a non-heterosexual is not abuse in the first place, but all the reactionary movement has to do is convince people to believe in one lie, and all the other bigger lies become more believable. All of a sudden, they are protesting outside of Disney World and bringing guns into the park, and then something worse happens. The reactionary movement is not about children or abuse or whatever they mistakenly believe grooming actually is. The movement is about forcing LGBTQ people back into the closet where they cannot openly defend themselves, weakening their public presence, damaging their reputation, all in the service of removing their rights through the courts. That is their actual goal, and they are using children as pawns to accomplish this. The reactionary movement might superficially and reluctantly agree that LGBTQ people exist and may even have the right to exist, but that their existence is intrinsically more adult, more sexual, and therefore inappropriate and even dangerous around children. This is not true, but this is how they think, or at least this is how they want you to think. Why do they think this way? Well, it's all part of an explicit belief and pervasive attitude called heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is a cultural attitude and belief that heterosexuality is the normal, natural sexuality. And if it is normal and natural, other sexualities are less normal, less natural, and consequently deviant in some way that makes them dangerous. Heteronormativity developed from the pervasiveness of heterosexuality as the perceived numerical majority sexual orientation. When a numerical majority is recognized, people label it a cultural default, regardless of how the numerical majority developed. This numerical majority often becomes a social majority, the group with the greatest social power. Subsequently, a social hierarchy is developed that mistakes the majority for the correct group, morally correct, or the neutral group, morally neutral. Anything outside of this is labeled morally incorrect or morally beneath the neutrality of the cultural default. The numerical majority can be counted, but the designation of moral correctness is completely arbitrary. This belief creates a social hierarchy of sexualities, in which heterosexuality is at the apex, permitting heterosexuals the privileges of being culturally invisible, as well as immunity to having their sexuality criticized, demonized, or subjugated through the law. Heterosexuals rarely have to explain their heterosexuality, but non-heterosexuals are often forced to both explain and justify their sexual orientation to other people. This is the privilege that is afforded those atop a social hierarchy, and for non-heterosexuals, these are the consequences to existing on any other position on this very hierarchy. Similarly, cisgender people also exist invisibly and without question, whereas transgender people are forced to explain and justify their very existence. Those are the power dynamics of a social hierarchy. Put more simply, LGBTQ people might be able to get away with making little jokes about cisgender heterosexual people, but those jokes do no real harm to the straight community, whereas straight people can create rhetoric that demonizes LGBTQ people and often get away with it, and in doing so create a dangerous atmosphere for LGBTQ people. Same-sex couples cannot threaten to ban different-sex couples from getting married, but different-sex couples can threaten to ban same-sex couples from getting married. This was standard operating procedure for a long time, and it may or may not be returning. The power dynamics of this artificial social hierarchy do not allow for the numerical minority or social minority to hold real power over the numerical majority or social majority. Heteronormativity and homophobia are connected but are not the same. Heteronormativity is the cultural belief that heterosexuality is the natural sexuality and that society both does and should function under this belief. Homophobia is the implicit bias, fear, disgust, and discrimination that results from heteronormative ideas. Heteronormativity and cisnormativity are also connected but are not exactly the same. Cisnormativity is the belief in a gender binary and the resulting belief that society both does and should function this way. Heteronormativity relies on cisnormativity because it too must rely on a gender binary. Cisnormativity therefore exists within heteronormativity. When someone refers to heteronormativity, they are always in one way or another also referring to cisnormativity. As explained by Marilyn Gabriel Miller, as I like to put it for the sake of simplicity, heteronormativity, the curious idea that your genitals dictate your behavior. Now you know what it means when someone tells you, "That's not very ladylike," or tells you to man up. What they are doing is reminding you to act like your genitals. Whether cisnormativity is a byproduct of heteronormativity or vice versa, the term heteronormativity will be used to encompass both herein. Heteronormativity attempts to justify itself with the claim that heterosexuality produces offspring, whereas homosexuality does not. Heteronormative attitudes rest upon the belief that procreative sex is more significant than non-procreative sex, and because of this, and because heterosexuality is more common, heterosexuals should be seen as inherently more valuable as people, as fully human, and that non-heterosexuals should be seen as less valuable as people or not fully human. Because same-sex couples cannot produce offspring, their sexual acts are not for the purpose of procreation. A heteronormativist argues that due to this, sexual acts performed by same-sex couples must be acted upon by lust alone, instead of procreation. This reasoning is problematic for a number of reasons, both logical and moral. In pragmatic terms, the vast majority of heterosexual intercourse is not for procreation, and never has been. As explained by Hannah Blank, author of Straight: The Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality, people often attempt to justify the heterosexual-homosexual scheme on the basis of the fact that while different sex couples can engage in reproductive sex, same-sex couples cannot. But reproduction is hardly the only reason different sex couples engage in sexual activity. It cannot be, for purely mechanical reasons, because a specific sexual act must be performed by two fertile people of different biological sexes at the right time of the menstrual cycle for conception to even be possible. Procreative sexual activity can only possibly account for a small subset of all sexual activity between men and women. If the vast majority of sexual acts between different sex couples is not for procreation, and heteronormativity is supported by the idea that sex is for procreation, how then could a heteronormativist believe that heterosexuality must sit atop a hierarchy of sexualities? It ties into privilege. Since different sex couples can theoretically produce offspring, all their other sexual acts, even those designed not to produce offspring, are a privilege. A privilege that can and should be denied to same-sex couples as punishment. If a different sex couple performs a sexual act that is designed not to produce offspring, and a same-sex couple performs the same sexual act that does not produce offspring, a heteronormative perspective is that the different sex couple's sexual act is still more socially acceptable, more significant, more meaningful, and less dangerous than the same act performed by the same-sex couple. The normal and natural argument falls apart almost instantly, and the true purpose of subjugating and condemning non-heterosexuals becomes clear. Furthermore, many different sex couples cannot or will not produce children. Does this make them less than human? Should they have less rights in society like non-heterosexuals often do? Should they be viewed with suspicion and seen as dangerous, also like non-heterosexuals often are? What about when a heterosexual couple ages out of the window of reproduction? Are they now, too, effectively the same as a same-sex couple, on the same rung of the artificial social hierarchy? What if a same-sex couple adopts a child? Have they achieved the status of heterosexuals? If so, why are heterosexuals often committed to denying them these children? What if a same-sex couple uses artificial insemination to biologically produce a child? Are they now effectively a heterosexual couple within the worldview of heteronormative ideals? If heteronormativity is justified through child raising, hasn't this same-sex couple achieved that status? Is this same-sex couple now above a different sex couple that chooses not to have children? What about nuns and other religious people who take vows of celibacy? The existence of a same-sex couple, or a couple that does not produce offspring, is not dangerous to society. Homosexuality and childless couples have always existed, and the world continues to grow. Even if it were a danger to population growth or something, human beings are under no obligation to become brood mares for others. If one were to claim someone does have this obligation and must reproduce against their will, I'm sorry, but that is a non-consensual sexual demand. Or, you know, what it's normally called. The worth of a human being cannot be measured on who they love or how well their sexuality can be exploited for resources. This is inhuman because it treats human beings as things, not people. An extreme emphasis on social class by way of how many children one can produce brushes up against eugenics and fascism. Heteronormativity is not pervasive because of some neutral scientific perspective. It is pervasive because its byproduct is so powerful, homophobia. People are desperate for justifications for their bigotries, and the children argument is good enough for them so long as they don't have to look at it too closely. How convenient that this reactionary movement has decided that the most important quality that makes someone human is a quality that same-sex couples often lack. It's almost like they cling to it for that reason. Imagine that. It's a self-fulfilling moral accusation. Reproduction is inherently good. Not reproducing is inherently evil. Same-sex couples cannot reproduce. So... Heteronormativity springs from an antiquated traditionalism. There is a binary, there is normal, and anything outside the binary is bad, and anything outside of artificial normalcy is degenerate. History shows us that degeneracy is an excellent scapegoat, an excellent fear tactic to grab power. Most people are familiar with this image of Nazis burning books, but most people do not know that these books are from the German Institute of Sexology, an academic foundation that researched human sexuality and advocated for the rights of same-sex couples. It was the first sexology research facility in the world, and it performed early research regarding transgender and intersex people. Someone might not subscribe to all of these heteronormative ideals, as some are more extreme than others, but still subscribe to some of them. Someone might claim that they have nothing against gay people, or some of my friends are gay, or any other common defensive statement, but if they also believe that heterosexuals should exist above non-heterosexuals due to the likelihood of procreation or some other reason, they are subscribing to heteronormative ideals. Heteronormativity creates a bias against non-heterosexuals as less worthy human beings, making them vulnerable to dehumanization.
I can't get answers from the attorneys really, but they're saying that somebody's, it's involving a gay bar or some shit. I don't know. I don't know what the heck he did at a gay bar. I don't know what's going on.
Well, he's accused of going on a mass shooting at a gay bar and killing 5 people.
Colorado.
Okay, well, that's shit. If he's accused of doing that, I'm surprised he's not gay. You know, I'd say that, but he's not gay. There was a shooting involving, multiple people.
Right.
And then later on going to find that it's a gay bar.
Yeah, right. And
I was like, oh my God, is he gay? I was scared. Oh my God, shit, is he gay? And he's not gay, so it's
well, you guys had conversations about that. You were.
Oh yeah,
I was
adamant.
Told him, yeah, you were adamant that gay is bad.
I'm a Mormon. I'm a conservative Republican, and we don't do gay. We don't do gay.
Yeah.
Heteronormativity posits not only that heterosexuality is the normal sexuality, but that those outside of heterosexuality are abnormal in ways beyond their sexuality. That the mere fact of being non-heterosexual makes them suspect in ways unrelated to consensual romantic and sexual activity. This accounts for how a reactionary movement against the LGBTQ community can grab hold of people, even people nominally outside of the right wing, because people have been conditioned to think of non-heterosexual people as suspicious and as part of a subculture more than a sexual orientation. A subculture that is somehow, without much evidence, dangerous. Being gay is not somehow more sexual or more adult than being straight. People think otherwise because of the pervasiveness of heteronormativity. This pervasiveness creates an implicit bias, a nagging feeling in the brain whenever heterosexuality and non-heterosexuality are compared. This notion of elevated sexuality among non-heterosexual people has no basis in reality. When heteronormativists claim that gay people are inherently more sexual, they use offensive examples or straw man examples. In the former, they reference the prevalence of HIV in the gay community in the 1980s and 1990s. However, the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases and infections are not easily pinned on one sexual orientation. A group having elevated rates of transmission has a variety of factors, and those factors are often not elevated sexual activity. Research finds different explanations, and such moralizing conclusions should not be reached. Heteronormativists use pride parades as their go-to that gay people are more sexual than straight people, but pride parades exist as self-defense from a society that shames gay people. Pride is the opposite of shame. That's why pride parades exist. Pride parades would not exist without gay people first being shamed for being gay. Pride parades are not celebrations of sex. They are a statement that the LGBTQ community will not be shamed. It must also be noted that heterosexuality is pushed into the public view far more than non-heterosexual orientations. See nearly every movie, television show, magazine, and commercial from the past 100 years. This parade, kinky or not, barely exists compared to the onslaught of heterosexuality. Children are exposed to heterosexual activity far more than non-heterosexual activity. Also, pride parades may exist in public, but attendance is not mandatory. You don't have to bring your kids. You don't have to bring yourself either. So, do gay people have more sex than straight people? Nope. As explained by Dr. Justin Lehmiller, founder and owner of Sex and Psychology, if we look at the median number of sex partners in the National Health and Social Life Survey, a nationally representative sex survey conducted in the United States, we see that gay men only outpace heterosexual men by 1. Other studies have reported similar findings. Thus, the majority of gay and heterosexual men are actually pretty similar in this regard. Even if non-heterosexuals did have much more sex than heterosexuals, that still would not make them dangerous to simply exist around children. The idea that gay men are more dangerous to children is a myth. Again from Dr. Lehmiller, crime statistics reveal that the vast majority of people who molest children are male, and the vast majority of their victims are female. This tells us that there are far more heterosexual child molesters in the world than anything. On a side note, psychological research has demonstrated that gay men show no more sexual arousal in response to images of male children than heterosexual men show in response to images of female children. This tells us that sexual attraction to children is an entirely separate issue from sexual orientation, and that we should not be conflating sexual identities with sex crimes. Moral haranguing about children being read stories by a drag queen or being in the presence of a teacher married to someone of the same gender is not based in science. It is based in bias, and that bias comes from heteronormativity. The byproduct of heteronormativity is homophobia, and the byproduct of homophobia is discrimination and even hate crimes. Anti-LGBTQ hate crimes have increased over the past few years. 2021 was the deadliest year on record for trans and non-gender conforming people. There was a massacre at a gay club only a few weeks ago at the time of this writing, and no, the shooter was not non-binary. This was debunked almost immediately. It was a transparent ploy. Even if he were, that would not change the calculus of why this happened. This reactionary movement loves to pin crimes on LGBTQ people, such as when the Uvalde shooter was erroneously identified as a trans woman. Not true. Fact-checked as false. The reactionary movement also loves to invent stories, such as the make-believe instance of a school allowing children to identify as cats and play in kitty litter. Not true. Fact-checked as false. This is part of the demonization of LGBTQ people, and we are watching it happen. Every time you see this, recognize why this movement is making these erroneous claims. To summarize, it is not dangerous for someone under the age of 18 to be in the same room as someone who is married to a person of the same gender or someone who is wearing a dress regardless of their gender. It is dangerous, however, to falsely claim that this is dangerous, because the resulting dehumanization has genuine, demonstrable, real-world, life-or-death consequences. In doing this, the reactionary movement has sacrificed the lives and well-being of countless people in service of keeping children away from something that poses them no actual harm. Children are not in danger being around non-heterosexuals. They are in danger being around armed fascists. Hi everybody. If you like what I do, make sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. Also check out my Patreon link. See you soon.